my dear students. Welcome to Teacher at Home. Today class we are going to learn the fifth chapter, session 3, Everyday Life, Culture and Politics. Print culture and modern world. It is difficult us to imagine a world without printed matter. We find evidence of print everywhere around us in books, journals, newspapers, prints of various painting and so on, and also in everyday life. Things like theater programs, official circulars, calendars, district diaries, advertisements, cinema posters, and street corners. We read printed literature, see printed images, follow the news through newspapers, and track public debates that appear in print. We take for granted this world of print and often forget that there was a time before print. We may not realize that print itself has a history which has in fact shaped our contemporary world. What is this history? When when did printed literature begin to circulate? When did printed we take for that is we may not realize itself the history here. How has it helped create the modern world? In this chapter, we look up at the development of print from its beginnings in East Asia to its expansion in Europe and in India. We'll understand the impact of spread of technology and consider how social lives and cultures changed with the coming of print. Bookmaking before the age of print from Aklai Nasri 1595. This is a royal workshop in the 16th century. Much before printing began in India, we can see the text being dictated, written, and illustrated. The art of writing and illustrating by hand was important in the age before print. Think about what happened to these forms of art with the coming of printing machines. The first printed books. The earliest kind of print technology was developed in China, Japan, and Korea. This was a system of hand printing. From AD 594 onwards, books in China was printed by rubbing paper, also invented there against the linked up surface of wood blocks, as both sides of the thin, porous sheet could not be printed. The traditional Chinese accordion book was folded and stitched at the side. Superbly skilled craftsmen could duplicate with remarkable accuracy the beauty of calligraphy. Calligraphy is the art of beautiful and stylish writing. The imperial state in China was for a long time the major producer of printed material. China possessed a huge bureaucratic system which recruited its personnel through civil service examinations. Textbooks for the examination was printed in vast numbers under the sponsorship of an imperial state. From the 16th century, the number of examination candidates went up and that increased the volume of print. By the 17th century, as urban culture bloomed in China, the use of print diversified. Print was no longer used just by scholar officials. Merchants used to print in their everyday life as a collected trade information. Reading increasingly becoming a leisure activity, the new leadership preferred fictional narratives, poetry, autographies, anthologies of literary masterpieces, and romantic plays. Rich women began to read, and many women began publishing their poetry and plays. Wives of scholar officials published their works, and courtesans wrote about their lives. This new reading culture was accompanied by a new technology. Western printing techniques and mechanical presses were important in the late 19th century as Western powers established their outposts in China. Shanghai became the hub of the new print culture, catering to the Western style schools. From hand printing, there was now a gradual shift for mechanical printing. Print in Japan. Buddhist missionaries from China introduced hand printing technology into Japan around 768-770. The oldest Japanese book printed in AD 868. The Buddhist diamond Sunu containing Surah containing 6 sheets of text and woodcut illustration. Pictures were printed on textiles, playing cards, and paper money. Medieval Japan, poets and prose writers were regularly published and books were cheap and abundant. Belonging to the mid 13th century, printing woodblocks of Tripitaka, Koreana are a Korean collection of Buddhist scriptures. They were engraved on about 80,000 woodblocks. They were inscribed on the UNESCO Memory of the World Register in 2007. Printing of visual material led to interesting publication practices. In the late 18th century, in the flourishing urban circles at Edo, later to be known as Tokyo, illustrated collections of printings Paintings depicted an elegant urban culture involving artists, courtesans, and tea house gatherings. Librarians and bookstores were packed with a hand printed material for various types books on women, musical instruments, calculations, tea ceremony, flower arrangements, proper etiquette, cooking, and famous places. Kitagawa Utamaro, born in Edo in 1753, was widely known for his distributions to an art form called ukiyo, pictures of the floating world or depictions of ordinary human experiences, especially urban ones. These prints traveled to contemporary US and Europe and influenced artists like Manet, Monet, and Van Gogh. Publishers like Sutaya Guzabura identified subjects and commissioned artists who drew the theme in outline. Then a skilled woodblock carver pasted the drawing of a woodblock and carved a printing block on the to reproduce the painter's lines. In this process, the original drawing would be destroyed and only prints would survive. A man looks out of the window at the snowfall while women prepare tea and perform other domestic duties. Print comes to Europe. For centuries, skills and spices from China flowed into Europe through its skilled route. In the 11th century, Chinese paper reached Europe via the same route. Paper made possible the production of manuscripts carefully written by scribes. Then, in 1295, Marco Polo, a great explorer, returned to Italy after many years of exploration in China. As you read about, China already had the technology of woodblock printing. Marco Polo brought his knowledge back with him. Now, Italians began producing books with word blocks, and soon the technology spread to other parts of the Europe. Luxury editions were still handwritten, very expensive, well meant to aristocratic circles and rich monastic libraries with scoffed at printed books at cheap vulgarities. Merchants and students in the university towns brought the cheaper printed copies. Vellum, a parchment made from the skin of animals. As the demand for books increased, booksellers all over Europe began exploring books to many different countries. Book fairs were held at different places. Production of handwritten manuscripts was also organized in new ways to meet the expanded demand. Scribes or skilled handwriters were no longer solely employed by wealthy or influential patrons, but increasingly by booksellers as well. More than 50 scribes often worked for one bookseller. But the production of handwritten manuscripts could not satisfy the ever increasing demand for books. Copying was an expensive, laborious, and time consuming business. Manuscripts were fragile, awkward to handle, and could not be carried around or read easily. Their circulation therefore remained limited. With the growing demand for books, woodblock printing gradually became more and more popular. By the early 15th century, woodblocks were being widely used in Europe to print textiles, playing cards, and religious pictures with simple brief text. There was clearly a great need for even quicker and cheaper reproduction of text. This could only be with the invention of a new print technology. The breakthrough occurred at Strasbourg, Germany, where Johann Gutenberg developed the first non-printing press in 1430s. Gutenberg and the printing press. Gutenberg was the son of a merchant and grew up on a large agricultural estate. From his childhood, he had seen wine and olive presses. Subsequently, he learned the art of publishing stones, became a master goldsmith, and also acquired the expertise to create lead molds used for making trinkets. Drawing on this knowledge, Gutenberg adapted existing technology to design his innovation. The olive press provided the model for the printing press, and models were used for casting the metal types for the letters in the alphabet. By 1448, Gutenberg perfected the system. The first book he printed was the Bible. About 180 copies were printed, and it took 3 years to produce them. By the standards of the time, this was fast production. The new technology did not entirely displace the existing art of producing books by hand. In fact, printed books at first closely resembled the written manuscripts in appearance and layout. The metal letters initiated the ornamental handwritten styles. Borders were illuminated by hand with foliage and other patterns, and illustrations were painted. In the books printed for the rich, space for decorations was kept blank on the printed page. Each purchaser could choose the design and decide on the paintings school that would do the illustrations. In the 100 years between 1450 and 1550, printing presses were set up in most countries of Europe. Printers from Germany traveled to other countries seeking work and helping start new presses. As the number of printing presses grew, book production boomed. The second half of the 15th century saw 20 million copies of printed books flooding in the markets in Europe. The number went up in the 16th century to about 200 million copies. This shift from hand printing to mechanical printing led to the printing revolution. Platen. A letter plus printing pattern is a board which is pressed up into back of the paper to get the impression from the type. At one time it is used as a wooden board, later it was made up of steel. Notice the long handle attached to the screw. This handle was used to turn the screw and press down the platen over the printing block that was placed on top of the sheet of damp paper. Gutenberg developed metal types of each of the 26 characters of the Roman alphabet, devised a way of moving them around so as to compose different words of the text. This came to be known as the movable type printing machine, and it remained the basic print technology over the next 300 years. Books could now be produced much faster than was possible when each print block was prepared by carving a piece of wood by hand. Gutenberg press could print 250 sheets on one side per hour. Platen in printing, that is letterpress printing platen. Gutenberg printed about 180 copies, of which no more than 50 have survived. Look at these pages of Gutenberg's Bible carefully. They were not just products of new technology. The text was printed in the new Gutenberg press with metal type, but the borders were carefully designed, painted, and illuminated by hand by artists. No two copies were the same. Every page of each copy was different. Even when two copies look similar, careful comparison will reveal differences. Elites everywhere preferred this lack of uniformity. What they possessed, they could be claimed as unique, for no one else owned a copy that was exactly the same. In the text, you will notice the use of color within the letters in various places. This had two functions: in added color to the page and highlighted at the holy words to emphasize their significance. But the color on every page was the text were added by hand. Gutenberg printed the text in black, leaving spaces where the color could be filled in later. The picture depicts what a printer's shop looked like in the 16th century. All the activities are going on under one roof. In the foreground on the right, compositors are at work, while on the left, galleys are being prepared and ink is being applied on the metal types. In the background, the printers were turning the screws of the press, and near him, proofreaders are at work. Right in front of the final product, the double page printed sheets stacked in neat piles waiting to be bound. The print revolution and its impact. What was the print revolution? It was not just a development, a new way of producing books. It transformed the lives of people, changing their relationship to information and knowledge and institutions and authorities. It influenced popular perceptions and opened up new ways of looking at things. Let us explore some of these changes. A new reading public. With the printing press, a new reading public emerged. Printing reduced the cost of books. The time and labor required to produce each book came down, and multiple copies could be produced with greater ease. Books flooded the market, reaching out an ever growing leadership. Access to books create a new culture of reading. Earlier, reading was restricted to the elites. Common people lived in a world of oral culture. They heard sacred books read out, ballads recited, and folk tales narrated. Knowledge was transferred orally. People collectively heard a story or saw a performance. As you will see in the chapter 8, they will not read a book individually and silently. Before the age of print, books were not only expensive, but they could not be produced in sufficient numbers. Now, books could reach out to wider sessions of people. If earlier there was a hearing public, now a reading public came into being. But the transition was not so simple. Books could be read only by literate, and the rate of literacy in most European countries were very low till the 20th century. How then could publishers pursue the common people to welcome the printed book? To do this, they had to keep in mind the wider reach of the printed work. Even those who did not read could certainly enjoy listening to books being read out. So printers began publishing popular ballads and folk tales, and such books would be profusely illustrated with pictures. These were then sung and recited at gatherings in villages and in taverns in towns. Oral culture thus entered print, and printed material was orally transmitted. The line that separated the oral and reading cultures became blurred, and the hearing public, reading public became intermingled. Ballad, a historical account of folk tale, in verse usually sung or recited. Taverns, places where people gathered to drink alcohol, to be served food, and to meet friends and exchange news. Religious debates, and the fear of print. Printer created the possibility of wide circulation of ideas, introduced a new world of debate and discussion. Even those who disagreed with the established authorities could now print and circulate their ideas. Through the printed message, they could persuade people to think differently and move them to action. They had significance in different spheres of life. Not everyone welcomed the printed book, and those who did not had fears about it. Many were apprehensive of the effect that the easy access to printed world and the wider circulation of books could have in people's mind. It was feared that if there was no control over what was printed and read, the irreligious thoughts might spread. If that happened, the authority of valuable literate could be destroyed, expressed by religious authorities and monarchs, as well as many writers and artists. This anxiety was the basis of widespread criticism to the new printed literature that had begun to circulate. Let us consider the implication of this in one sphere of life in early modern Europe, namely religion. 1517, the religious reformer Martin Luther wrote 95 is criticizing many of the practices and rituals of the Roman Catholic Church. A printed copy of this was posted on a church door in Wittenberg. It challenged the church to debate this idea. Luther's writings were immediately reproduced in vast numbers and read widely. This led to a division within the church and to the beginning of the Protestant Reformation. Luther's translations of the New Testament sold 5,000 copies within a few weeks, and a second edition appeared within 3 months. Deeply grateful to print, Luther said, printing is the ultimate gift of God and the greatest one. Several scholars, in fact, think that print about scholars, print about a new intellectual atmosphere and helped spread the new ideas that lead to the Reformation. Protestant Reformation, a 16th century movement to reform the Catholic Church dominated by Rome. Martin Luther was one of the main Protestant reformers. Several traditions of anti Catholic Christianity developed out in the movement. Print and dissent. Print and popular religious literature stimulated many distinctive individual interpretation of faith even among little educated working people. In the 16th century, Manocchio, a miller in Italy, began to read books that were available in his locality. He reinterpreted the message of the Bible and formulated a view of God and creation that engaged the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Church began its inquisition to repress the heretical ideas. Manocchio was hauled up twice and ultimately executed. The Roman Church, troubled by such effects of popular readings and questioning of faith, imposed several controls over publishers and booksellers and began to maintain an index of prohibited books from 1558. Inquisition, a former Roman Catholic court for identifying and publishing heretics, heretical beliefs which do not follow the accepted teachings of the church. In medieval times, heresy was seen as a threat to the right of the church to decide on what should be believed and what should not. Heretical beliefs were severely punished. Satiety, the state of being fulfilled, much beyond the point of satisfaction. Seditious, action, speech, of writing that is seen opposing the government. Fear of the book. Erasmus Erasmus is a Latin scholar and a Catholic reformer who criticized the excess of Catholicism but kept his distance from Luther, expressed a deep anxiety about printing. He wrote in Adages, to what corner of the book do they not fly, the swarms of new books? It may be that one here and that contributes something worth knowing, but the very multitude of them is hurtful to scholarship because it creates a glut, and even in good things, satiety is more harmful. Filling the world with books, not just trifling things, such as I write perhaps, not but stupid, ignorant, slanderous, scandalous, raving, irreligious, and seditious books, and the number of them is such that even the valuable publication lose their value. Reading mania. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, literacy rates went up most parts of Europe. Churches of different denominations set up schools in villages, carrying literacy to peasants and artisans. By the end of the 18th century, in some parts of the Europe, literacy rates were as high as 60 to 80 percentage. As literacy and schools spread in European countries, there was a virtual reading mania. People wanted books to read, and printers produced books in ever increasing numbers. New forms of popular literature appeared in print, targeting new audiences. Booksellers employed peddlers who roamed around villages carrying little books for sale. There were almanacs of uh, ritual calendars along with ballads and folktales, but other forms of reading matter, largely for entertainment, began to reach ordinary readers as well. In England, penny chap books were carried by petty peddlers known as chapmen and sold for a penny so that even the poor could buy them. In France, were the bibliothèque, which were low priced small books printed on poor quality paper and bound in cheap blue covers. Then there were the romances printed on 4 or 6 pages and those substantial historics which were stories about the past. Books were of various sizes, serving many different purposes and interests. Periodical press developed from the early 18th century, combining information about current affairs with entertainment. Newspapers and journals carried information about wars and trade, as well as news of the development and other places. Similarly, the ideas of the scientist and philosopher now become more accessible to the common people. Ancient and medieval scientific texts were compiled and published, and maps and scientific diagrams were widely printed. When scientists like Isaac Newton began to publish their discoveries, they could influence a much wider circle of scientifically minded readers. The writing of the thinkers such as Thomas Paine, Voltaire, and Jean Jacques Rousseau were also widely printed and read. Thus, their idea about science, reason, and rationality found their way into popular literature. In 1791, a London publisher, James Lackington, wrote in his diary, "The sale of books in general has increased prodigiously within the last 20 years. The poorer sort of farmers and even the poor country people in general, who before that period spent their winter evenings in relating stories of witches, ghosts, hobgoblins, now shorten the winter night by hearing the sons and daughters read them tales, romances, etc. If John goes to town with a load of hay, he is charged to be sure not to forget to bring home very grand pickles advantager, and when Dolly is sent to sell her eggs, she is commissioned to purchase the history of Joseph Andrews. Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world. By the mid 18th century, there was a common conviction that books were a means of spreading progress and enlightenment. Many believed that books could change the world, liberate society from despotism and tyranny, and herald a time when reason and intellect would rule. Louis Sebastian Mercier, a novelist in 18th century France, declared the printing press is the most powerful engine in progress and public opinion is the force that will seep despotism away. In many of the Mercier's novels, the heroes were transformed by acts of reading. The Devo books are lost in the world's book, create and become enlightened in the process. Convinced of the power of print in bringing enlightenment and destroying the basis of despotism, Mercier proclaimed, "Tremble, therefore, tyrants of the world, tremble before the virtue writer." Print culture and the French Revolution. Many historians have argued that print culture created the conditions within which a French Revolution occurred. Can we make such a connection? Three types of arguments have been usually put forward. First, print popularized the ideas of enlightened thinkers. Collectively, the writings provide a critical commentary on tradition, superstitions, and despotism. They argued for the rule of reason rather than custom and demanded that everything be judged through the application of reason and rationality. They attacked the sacred authority of the church and the despotic power of the state, thus eroding the legitimacy of the social order based on tradition. The writings of Voltaire and Rousseau were read widely, and those who read the books saw the world through new eyes that were questioning, critical, and rational. Second, print created a new culture of dialogue and debate. All values, norms, and institutions were re-evaluated and discussed by a public that had become aware of the power of reason and recognized the need of question existing ideas and beliefs. Then the public culture, new ideas of social revolution came into being. Third, by the 1780s, there were an outpouring of literature that mocked the royalty and criticized the morality. In the process, it traced. This is how Mercier describes impact of the printed world and the power of reading in one of the books. Anyone who had seen me reading would have compared me to a man dying of thirst who was gulping down some fresh pour water. Lighting my lamp with extraordinary caution, I threw myself hungrily into reading. Annie's eloquence, effortless and animated, carried me from one page to the next without my noticing it. A clock struck off the hours in the silence of the shadows, and had nothing. My lamp began to run out of oil and produced only a pale light, but still I read on. I could not even take out time to raise the wick of fear of interrupting my pleasure. Now those new ideas rushed into my brain, how my intelligence adopted them. Quoted by Robert Dampton, The Forbidden Bestsellers of Revolutionary France, 1995. Despotism, a system of governance in which absolutely power is exercised by an individual, unregulated by legal and constitutional checks. Questions about the existing social order. Cartoons and caricatures typically suggested that the monarchy remained absorbed only in sensual pleasures while the common people suffered immense hardship. The literature circulated underground and led to the growth of hostile sentiments against the monarchy. How do we look at the arguments? There can be no doubt that print helps the spread of ideas. But we must remember that people did not read just one kind of literature. If they read the ideas of Voltaire and Rocher, they were also exposed to monarchical and church propaganda. They were not influenced directly by everything they read or saw. They accepted some ideas and rejected others. They interpreted things their own way. Print did not directly shape their minds, but it did open up the possibility of thinking differently. 19th century saw vast leaps in mass literacy in Europe, bringing a large number of new readers among children, women, and workers. Women, and workers. As primary education became compulsory from the late 19th century, children became an important category of readers. Production of school textbooks became critical for the publishing industry. A children's press devoted to literature for children alone was set up in France in 1857. This press published new works as well as the old fairy tales and the folk tales. The Grimm brothers in Germany spent years compiling traditional folk tales gathered from peasants. What they collected was edited before the stories was published in a collection in 1812. Anything that was considered unsuitable for children or would appear vulgar to the elites was not included in the published version. Rural folk tales that acquired a new form. In this way, print recorded old tales but also changed them. Women became important as readers as well as writers. Penny magazines were especially meant for women, as were manuals teaching proper behavior and housekeeping. When novels began to be written in the 19th century, women were seen as important readers. Some of the best known novelists were women: Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, George Eliot. The writing became important in defining a new type of woman, a person with will, strength of personality, determination, and the power to think. Lending libraries had been in existence from the 17th century onwards. The 19th century, leading libraries in England became instruments for educating white collar workers, artisans, and lower middle class people. Sometimes self educated women, working class, wrote for themselves. After the working day was gradually shortened from the mid 19th century, workers had some time for self improvement and self expression. They wrote political tracts and autobiographies in large numbers. Thomas Wood, a Yorkshire mechanic, narrated how he would run old newspapers and read them by firelight in the evenings as he could not afford candles. Autobiographies of poor people narrated the struggles to read against grim obstacles. The 20th century Russian revolutionary author Maxim Gorky's My Childhood and My University provide glimpses of such struggles. Further innovations. By the late 19th, 18th century, the press came to be made up of metal. Though the 19th century, there was a series of further innovations in printing technology. By the mid 19th century, Richard M. Howe of New York had perfected the power driven cylindrical press. This was capable of printing 8,000 sheets per hour. This press was particularly useful for printing newspapers. In the late 19th century, the offset press was developed, which could print up to 6 colors at a time. From the turn of the 20th century, electrically operated presses accelerated printing operations. A series of other developments followed. Methods of feeding paper improved, the quality of plates became better, automatic paper reads, while photoelectric controls of the color register were introduced. The accumulation of several individual mechanical improvements transformed the appearance of printed text. Printers and publishers continuously developed new strategies to sell their product. 19th century periodicals serialized important novels which gave birth to a particular way of writing novels. In the 1920s in England, popular works were sold in cheap series called the shilling series. The desk cover or the book jacket is also a 20th century innovation. With the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, publishers feared a decline in book purchases. To sustain buying, they bought out cheap paperback editions. India and the world of print. Let us see what printing began in India and how ideas and informations were written before the age of print. Manuscripts before the age of print. India had a very rich and old tradition of handwritten manuscripts in Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, as well as in various vernacular languages. Manuscripts were copied on palm leaves or on handmade paper. Pages were sometimes beautifully illustrated. They would be either pressed between wooden covers or sewn together to ensure preservation. Manuscripts continued to be produced till well after the introduction of print down to the late 19th century. Manuscripts, however, were highly expensive and fragile. They had to be handled carefully and they could not be read easily as the script was written in different styles. So, manuscripts were not widely used in everyday life. Even though pre colonial Bengal had developed an extensive network of village primary school students were often did not read text. They only learned to read. Teachers dictated portions of text from memory and students wrote them down. Many thus became literate without ever actually reading any kind of text. Print comes to India. The printing press first came to Goa with Portuguese missionaries in the mid 16th century. Jesuit priests learned Konkani and printed several tracts. By 1674, about 50 books had been printed in the Konkani and the Kangara language. Catholic priests printed the first Tamil book in 1579 at Cochin, and in 1713 the first Malayalam book was printed by them. By 1710, Dutch Protestant missionaries had printed 32 Tamil texts, many of them translations of older works. The English language press did not grow in India until quite late, even though the English East India Company began to import presses from the late 17th century. From 1780, James Augustine Hickey began to edit the Bengali Gazetted, a weekly magazine that described itself as a commercial paper open to all but influential by none. So it was a private English enterprise, proud of its independence from colonial influence, that began English printing in India. Hickey published a lot of advertisements, including those that related to the import and sale of slaves. But he also published a lot of gossip about the company's senior officials in India. Enraged by this, Governor General Warren Hastings persecuted Hickey and encouraged the publication of official sanctioned newspaper could counter the flow of information that damaged the image of the colonial government. By the close of the 18th century, a number of newspapers and journals appeared in print. There were Indians too, who began to publish Indian newspapers. The first to appear was the weekly Bengal Gazette brought out by Gangadhar Bhattacharya, who was close to Ram Mohan Roy. Religious reforms and public debates. From the early 19th century, as you know, there were intense debates around religious issues. Different groups confronted the changes happening within colonial society in different ways, offered a variety of new interpretations of the beliefs of different religions. Some criticized existing practices and campaigned for reform, while others countered the arguments of reformers. The debates were carried into public and in print. Printed tracts and newspapers not only spread the new ideas, but they shape the nature of the debate. A wider public could now participate in the public discussions and express their views. New ideas emerged through the clashes of opinions. This was a time of intense controversy between social and religious reforms and the Hindu orthodoxy over matters like widow immolation, monotheism, Brahmanical priesthood, and idolatry. In Bengal, as the debate developed, tracts and newspapers proliferated, circulating a variety of arguments. To reach a wider audience, the ideas were printed in the everyday spoken language of ordinary people. Ramamohan Roy published the Samad Kaumudi from 1821 and the Hindu Orthodoxy commissioned Samad Chandrika to oppose opinion from 1822 to Persian newspaper were published Jamai Jagannath and Shamsud Akbar. In the same year, a Gujarati newspaper, the Bombay Samaja, made its appearance. In North India, the ulama were deeply anxious about the collapse of Muslim dynasties. They feared that colonial rulers would encourage conversion change the Muslim personal laws. To counter this, they would cheap lithographic presses, publish Persian and Urdu translations of holy scriptures, and printed religious newspapers and tracts. The Deoband Seminary, founded in 1867, published thousands of fatwas telling Muslim readers how to conduct themselves in their everyday lives and explaining the meaning of Islamic doctrines. All through the 19th century, a number of Muslim seats and seminaries appeared, each with a different interpretation of faith, each keen on enlarging in following and countering the influence of its opponents. Urdu print helped them conduct these battles in public. Among Hindus, to print encouraged the reading of religious texts, especially in the vernacular language. The first printed edition of the Ramcharitamanasu of Tulsidas, a 16th century text, came out from Calcutta in 1810. By the mid 19th century, cheap lithographic editions flooded North Indian markets. From the 1880s, the Naval Kishore Press at Lucknow and the Sri Venkateshwar Press in Bombay published numerous religious texts in vernaculars in the printed and portable form. They could be read easily by the faithful at any place and time. They could also be read out to large groups of literate men and women. Religious texts therefore reached a wide circle of people, encouraging discussions, debates, and controversies within and among different religions. Print did not only stimulate the publication of conflicting opinions amongst communities, but it also connected communities and people in different parts of India. Newspapers conveyed news from one place to another, creating pan-Indian identities. News forms of publication. Printing created an appetite for new kinds of writing. As more and more people could now read, they wanted to see their own lives, experience, emotions, and relationships reflected in what they read. The novel, a literary form which had developed in Europe, ideally catered into its need. It soon acquired distinctively Indian forms and styles. For readers, it opened up new worlds of experience and gave a vivid sense of the diversity of human lives. Other new literary forms also entered the world of reading, lyrics, short stories, essays about social and political matters. In different ways, they reinforced the new emphasis on human lives and intimate feelings about the political and social roots that shape such things. By the end of the 19th century, a new visual culture was taking shape. With the setting up of an increasing number of printing presses, visual images could be easily reproduced in multiple copies. Painters like Raja Ravivarma produced images for mass circulation. Poured wood engravers who made woodblockers set up shop near the little presses, letter presses, and were employed by print shops. Cheap prints and calendars easily available in the bazaar could be brought even by the poor to decorate the walls of their homes or place of work. These prints began shaping popular ideas among modernity and tradition, religion and politics, society and culture. By the 1870s, caricature and cartoons were being published in journals and newspapers commenting on social and political issues. Some caricatures ridiculated and educated Indians' fascination with Western taste and clothes, while others expressed the fear of social change. There were imperial caricatures, lambooning nationalists as well as the nationalist cartoons criticizing imperial rule. Women and print. Lives and feeding of women began to be written in particularly vivid and intense ways. Women's reading therefore increased enormously in middle class homes. Liberal husbands and fathers began educating their women folk at home, sent them to schools, while women's schools were set up in the cities and towns after the mid 19th century. Many journals began carrying writings by women and explained why women should be educated. They also carried a syllabus and attached suitable reading matter which could be used for home based schooling. But not all families were liberal. Conservative Hindus believed that a literate girl would be widowed, and Muslims feared that educated women would be corrected by reading Urdu romances. Sometimes liberal women defied such prohibition. We know the story of a girl in a conservative Muslim family of North India who secretly learned to read and write in Urdu. Her family wanted her to read only the Arabic Quran, which she did not understand. So she insisted on learning to read a language that was her own. In East Bengal in the early 19th century, Raj Sundari Devi, a young married girl in a very orthodox household, learned to read it in the secrecy of her kitchen. Later, she wrote her autobiography, Amar Jiban, which was published in 1876. It was the first full-length autobiography published in the Bengali language. Since social reforms and novels had already created a great interest in women's lyrics and lives and emotions, there was also an interest in what women would have to say about their own life. From the 1860s, a few Bengali women, like Kailasha Binib Devi, wrote books highlighting the experience of women about how women were imprisoned at home, kept in ignorance, forced to do hard domestic labor, and treated unjustly by the very people they served. In the 1880s, in present day Maharashtra, Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai wrote with passion and anger about the miserable lives of upper caste. Hindu women, especially widows, a woman in a Tamil novel expressed what reading meant to women who were so greatly confined by social regulations. For various reasons, my world is small. More than half my life's happiness has come from books. While Urdu, Tamil, Bengali, and Marathi print culture had developed early, Hindi printing began seriously only from 1870s. Soon a large segment of it was devoted to the education of women. In the early 20th century, journals written for and sometimes edited by women became extremely popular. They discussed issues like women's education, widowhood, widow remarriage, and the national movement. Some of them offered household and fashion lessons to women and brought entertainment through short stories and serialized novels. In Punjab, too, a similar folk literature was widely printed from the early 19th century, 20th century. Ramchandra published the fast-selling Sri Dharma Vihar to teach women how to be obedient wives. Fast-selling to teach obedient wives. The Carlos Tract Society published cheap booklets with a similar message. Many of them were in the form of dialogue about the quality of the good wealth. In Bengal and earlier in central Calcutta, the Batala was devoted to the printing of popular books. Here you could buy cheap editions of religious tracts and scriptures as well as the literature that was considered obscene and scandalous. By the late 19th century, a lot of the books were being profusely illustrated with woodcuts and colored lithographs. Peddlers took the Batala publications to homes, enabling women to read them in their leisure time. Print and the poor people. Very cheap small books were brought to markets in the 19th century. The picture suggests traditional family roles. The Sahib holds a liquor bottle in his hand while the Sahib plays the violin. Madras towns and sold at crossroads, allowing poor people traveling to market to buy them. Public libraries were set up from the early 19th or 20th century, expanding the access to books. These libraries were located mostly in cities and towns, and at times in prosperous villages. For rich local patrons, setting up library was a way of acquiring prestige. From the late 19th century, the issues of caste discrimination began to be written about in my printed tracts and essays. Judivalu Phule, the Maratha pioneer to low caste protest movements, wrote about the injustice of the caste system in the Gulamgiri In the 20th century, B.R. Ambedkar in Maharashtra and E.R. Ramaswamy Naikar in Madras, better known as Periyar, or powerfully on caste, and their writings were read by people all over India. Local protest movements and sets also create a lot of popular journals and tracts criticizing ancient scriptures and advising a new and just future. Workers in factories were to be overworked and lacked the education to write up much about their experience. But Kasi Baba, a Kanpur mill worker, wrote and published Chole or Bade Ka Saval in 1938 to show the links between caste and class exploitation. The poems of another Kanpur mill worker who wrote under the name of Sundarshan Char between 1935 and 1954 were brought together and published in a collection called Sajik Kavidayam, Kavilayam. By the 1930s, Bangalore cotton mill workers set up libraries to educate themselves, following the examples of Bombay workers. This was sponsored by social reformers who tried to restrict excessive drinking among them to bring literacy and sometimes to propagate the message of nationalism. Print and censorship. Before 1798, the colonial state under the East India Company was too not too concerned with censorship. Strangely, its early measures to control printed matter were directed against Englishmanship in India, who were critical of company misrule and hated the actions of particular company officers. A company was worried that such criticism might be used by the critics in England to attack the trade monopoly in India. By the 1920s, the Calcutta Supreme Court passed certain regulations to control press freedom, and the company began encouraging publication of newspapers that would celebrate British rule. 1835, faced with urgent petitions by editors of English and vernacular newspapers, Governor General Benedict agreed to revise press laws. Thomas Macaulay, a liberal colonial official, formulated new rules that restored the earlier freedoms. After the revolt of 1857, the attitude of freedom of the press changed. Enraged Englishmen demanded a clamp down on the native press. A vernacular newspaper became assertively nationalist. The colonial government began debating and measure of stringent control. In 1878, the Vernacular Press Act was passed, modeled on the Irish press laws. It provided the government with extensive right to censor reports, editorials in the vernacular press. From now on, the government kept regular track on the vernacular newspaper published in different provinces. When a report was judged as seditious, the newspaper was warned, and if the warning was ignored, the press was liable to be seized and the printing machinery confiscated. Despite repressive measures, nationalist newspapers grew in numbers in all parts of India. They reported colonial misrule and encouraged nationalist activities. Attempts to throttle nationalist criticism provoked militant protest. This in turn led to a renewed cycle of persecution and protest. When Punjab revolutionaries were deported in 1907, Balagangadhar Tilak wrote with great sympathy about them in this casery. This led to the imprisonment in 1908, provoking in turn widespread protests all over India. So that's all about this chapter. If you are interested, please do like, share, and subscribe my channel. Okay, thank you.